I've spoken the issue to death when it comes to covering how the Liberal Party of Australia, the conservative side of politics in this country, in the aftermath of an election this year in 2025, has kind of slowly been imploding over the course of the last couple of months. And it astounds me, the similarities between us and our Commonwealth brothers in Canada, where over the last week or so, the Conservative opposition there, after losing an election this year, has also witnessed a quite catastrophic implosion at a crucial time in Canadian politics. A quick bit of backstory when it comes to Canadian politics this year. Their election earlier on in the year, just before ours, was an absolute roller coaster. One of the most entertaining and insane races that I have seen in my life. And even from the Canadian perspective, it was an unbelievable race that broke the Canadian political party system and was just like, it was uncharted waters what we were witnessing in Canada this year. So towards the end of 2024 and the early parts of 2025, it looked like the Canadian election this year was going to be a complete write-off for the Conservatives. And backstory to backstory. There are four major players in Canadian politics, if you want to include the Bloc. Anyway, so we have in Canada the major players being the Liberal Party, which is a centre to centre-left political party, which has governed for most of Canada's history. You have the Conservatives, also called the Tories, representing the right. Then you have the NDP, the New Democratic Party, which represents the left, even more so than the Liberals themselves. And then you have the Bloc Québécois, which is the regional French nationalist party, specifically in the province of Quebec. So look at this. This is a very simplified version of what Canadian politics looks like. But the problem with this spectrum is that it doesn't properly encapsulate how much of a broad tent the Liberal Party in Canada actually is, because some people would argue that the spectrum looks less like this and more akin to something like this, where there is a significant amount of overlap between not only the Liberal Party and the NDP, but also the Liberal Party and the Tories themselves. This is a big reason why, in at least contemporary politics in Canada, the Liberal Party is so successful. It can appeal to the most voters in comparison to the NDP or the Tories, who may be kind of boxed into their ideological corners. But heading into 2025, it was essentially a catastrophe in every way imaginable for the Liberal Party. At the time, being led by Justin Trudeau, who had led the party since 2015. There was a lot of incumbency fatigue. There were plenty of scandals that had ridden Trudeau's government, unpopular policies, a lot of criticism over very slow economic growth in Canada, and it was getting like apocalyptic for the Liberal Party. Here's the problem with having such a broad political coalition like what the Liberals had, is that if things get bad enough and your reputation is tarnished enough, your voters have other options on both sides of your party. The most conservative members of the Liberal Party can easily justify going and voting for the Tories instead, and the most left-wing members of the Liberal Party have the NDP. So the party was bleeding from both ends in the lead-up to the 2025 election under Trudeau's leadership. And look, when I'm talking about bad for the Liberals, I mean bad. The Conservatives were polling, this was before Trudeau stepped aside, the Conservatives were polling upwards of 40% in most polls, which in normal circumstances in Canada is more than enough to win a majority in their first-past-the-post system. The Liberals themselves were crashing down into the 20s, and there was some polling even suggesting that the Liberals were going to be equal to or even underperforming the NDP, which has not happened in Canada since 2011. But of course, things did not remain that way. You guys probably heard that in the campaign, or the lead up to the campaign, Trudeau did step down, and elected in his place was Mark Carney, a man who had been the director of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of Canada, I believe, and also head of the Bank of England, a man with a lot of economic experience who was well known throughout Canada for being a reliable guy, having previously even worked with conservative governments. And this completely changed the shape of the race. Once Carney was in and Trudeau was gone, first thing, people who had left the Liberal Party specifically because of how unpopular Trudeau had become, they all came flooding back. And then when it became apparent that the Liberals could actually win the election from their unwinnable position like weeks earlier, that's when people, particularly from the NDP, started jumping ship and saying, you know what, the Tories under their leader, Pierre Poilievre, unacceptable, but now that there is actually a chance Liberals could win, we have to back the Liberals. So the NDP tanked in support, the Liberal Party spiked, and we saw a polling turnaround that looked like this. I have never seen anything like that in a Western free election. So anyway, the election finally rolls around and we get this unbelievable result right here. It is the most like earthquake election result in terms of what Canada is used to in decades. We went from effectively a three-party system nationally, or four if you want to include the bloc, to really just a two-party contest here, really, with both. This is probably, I think, it is the highest share of the vote the two major parties have gotten combined since the 1950s. So a massive overperformance for both the Conservatives and the Liberals, at the cost, somewhat to the bloc, and largely at the expense of the NDP. And at the end of the day, it ended with a minority government, with Carney just a few seats short of a majority position. And he didn't. Well, it's tricky because in Canada, when there's a situation like this, they don't tend to do coalitions like we think of. There aren't normally like supply and confidence agreements in place. There's sort of like an agreed upon rule that if you're the largest party to the extent that Carney has right now, being only a few seats short, you basically get to govern unless there is some massive controversy and a confidence motion against you. It is kind of like what's happening at the moment in Tasmania, which I always love bringing up, like how the Liberal Party in Tasmania has the most seats and was commissioned as a minority government. And the reason that they're still in government is because, well, nobody wants to force another election. Despite the fact that there is a progressive majority in the Tasmanian House of Assembly, none of them are willing to tear down the government. So the Liberals just get to keep going with no real conference agreement at all, which is exactly what is happening in Canada at the moment with their Liberal Party. So Carney has his minority government, but of course that leaves him vulnerable to potential no-confidence motions. And one on the horizon that is coming up very soon is the passing of the next Canadian budget, which doesn't seem to have a lot of support outside of the Liberals themselves at the moment. I think probably the quickest way to sum up how the budget is perceived at the moment that Carney has put towards Parliament is that it has a lot of cuts and a lot of borrowing. The cuts are upsetting the Bloc and the NDP, where the amount of borrowing and deficit spending that's in there is upsetting the Conservatives. So there aren't a lot of friendly voices to negotiate to try and get this thing passed. So you would assume that would be the story of the week. You have a minority government with some very passionate opposition parties who probably aren't going to play ball, and if this budget doesn't pass, it will most likely lead to another election in early 2026. So that would be two elections in the span of 12 months if this thing doesn't pass and it's interpreted as a no-confidence motion in the government. But during Canadian Budget Week, the budget is not the story. The story instead is the chaotic catastrophe within the Canadian Conservatives. So, first and foremost, let's look at the Canadian Conservative Party, the Tories. They are, at the moment, very much defined by their leader, Pierre Poilievre, who I like to refer to as PP. Pierre Poilievre is a very interesting character who has very much dominated the political scene in Canada for the last couple of years. Since coming to power in the Conservative Party, he's represented a more right-wing shift. He very much neutered this potential breakaway movement called the People's Party in Canada. There was polling at a couple percent and taking votes away from the Tories. He did a fantastic job of basically bringing those voters back in, and he was the perfect foil to Justin Trudeau. Think of him as akin to Tony Abbott during the Gillard and then that couple months of Rudd, kind of the perfect opposition leader for the situation at hand, who did a terrific job of making the government look poor and incompetent. This was a political figure who defined himself, and his success came from the fact that he was able to completely outmaneuver Trudeau and perfectly paint him as the unpopular figure that he was. But when Trudeau left and was replaced with Carney, it became apparent very quickly that Pierre while he was an effective opposition leader in some circumstances, was not flexible enough as a politician to adjust to that sudden change in Liberal leadership. Because while Pierre was the perfect counter to Justin Trudeau, and he had a unique ability to unite the entirety of the Canadian right behind him, that style of politics hit a point of diminishing returns in that the more success he found doing that, the more he alienated and panicked left-wing Canadians. As we saw with a majority of NDP voters abandoning their party to go and support the Liberals just to try and stop Pierre from becoming Prime Minister. But that aside, it's undeniable that Pierre has a unique stranglehold on the Conservative Party since he took over. I think the best example of that is the fact that in the 2025 election that we were talking about just a couple minutes ago, Pierre actually lost his own seat, but was able to get back into Parliament because an MP of their own volition in the most conservative province in Canada, Alberta, just happened to step down, and then there was a by-election to get Pierre back into Parliament. Could you imagine if that happened here? Imagine if Peter Dutton, post-2025 election, said, you know what, I'm not done. My stranglehold on power within the coalition is so absolute, I'm going to go to Queensland. One MP there will coincidentally step down, and then I'll run in that by-election in an area I'm not even from, and then get back into Parliament to stay on as opposition leader. Unthinkable. So the important takeaway is that Pierre can essentially do whatever he wants. His control of the Conservative Party is so complete at this moment that he can, allegedly, ask MPs just to resign so he can get himself back into Parliament. But his approach to leadership was really going to be put to the test with the budget, because this was his opportunity to press as hard as he could against a minority government and see what changes he could get extracted out, Conservative showing of strength, but that has not been the case. If this budget week in Canada has shown anything, it is that there is serious concern and serious discontent among some of the more moderate members of the Conservative Party of Canada over Pierre's leadership style. As you might remember, I'll throw it up there again, there is actually somewhat of a significant overlap between the most centre-right Liberals and the most moderate Tories. A space where Tories in this area here are often referred to as red Tories. Like, they're Tories, but honestly, it's entirely understandable if they would rather be a member of the Liberal Party. And that is exactly what happened this week. In the middle of budget week, where as much media attention and scrutiny as possible is meant to be focused on the government, instead, it was the official opposition that everyone was paying attention to, because moderate Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont, whose name I'm fairly certain I'm pronouncing wrong, decided that he was going to defect to the Liberals, officially leaving the Tories and saying that it was specifically over issues of party culture and leadership in the Conservatives. D'Entremont, he's from Nova Scotia, not Quebec. I should say it much more English, but it's just hard. D'Entremont said that his main issue had to do with the fact that the Conservative Party room under Pierre Poilievre is purely negative. It is incredibly hostile, incredibly combative, and that it's run like a sorority. And allegedly, he claims that when rumours started circulating that he was going to defect, that a member of the Conservative Party barged into his staff and literally pushed one of his staffers out of the way just to yell at him for his decision to potentially switch over to the Liberals, which was the final nail in the coffin, according to him, as to why he did eventually defect. Now, for how the Conservatives reacted to this, their statement was basically, oh, this is D'Entremont just being, like, having sour grapes over the fact that we didn't re-nominate him as Deputy Speaker. This is purely personal. He is a liar, and he has betrayed his constituents. And yeah, that's one thing. But then the next day, Matt Genereux, another Conservative MP from Alberta this time, other side of the country, said that he would be resigning, not joining the Liberals, but rather just retiring from politics entirely in the coming months. Now, it was reported that Genereux, this second Conservative MP, originally was going to cross the floor, like D'Entremont. But a lot of French names here. Gotta love Canada. But Apparently, he was persuaded not to by members of the Conservative Party. Now, that is entirely just conjecture. But what we are certain of is that one MP crossed the floor to the Liberals, and then another one, who was allegedly being pressured both by the Liberals to switch and the Conservatives not to, just said, you know what, actually, I'm done with politics entirely, and I'm going to retire in the coming months. So you have one MP defecting to a minority government, getting them ever so close to majority status, however narrow, and then you have another MP allegedly being subject to pressure from all sides, deciding, you know what, actually, I'm done with politics entirely. I want to spend more time with my family. It's not a great look. And then, in the midst of all of this chaos, was the biggest Conservative blunder yet. So normally when a government introduces a budget in Canada, it's a natural part of the process that the official opposition gets to introduce an amendment, or like just some list of changes to the budget that could be made, which gets voted on in Parliament, basically to project how they would write up a budget in an alternate universe where they were the government. But here's the thing. Through some miscommunication or somebody forgetting to do something, the Conservatives never officially introduced an amendment to the budget, so the opposition basically forgot and never actually tabled an amendment motion, meaning that the official opposition would not be producing an opposition amendment budget at all, which is kind of the bare minimum you expect. So not only did they lose 2 MPs in 2 days, but on top of that, they forgot to do the one thing an opposition is supposed to do. Here's the budget of the government. Do you have any amendments you want to add? We forgot. The Conservatives did eventually manage to get their amendments put to a vote, but it was as a sub-amendment to the Bloc Québécois proposed amendments to the budget. So they had to basically piggyback on the Bloc to get a parliamentary vote on their amendments. And what happened? The Liberal government basically called their bluff and said, if that Conservative sub-amendment passes, we will consider it a vote of no confidence in the government. Basically, if the Conservatives get their amendment passed through Parliament, that means that the Liberals would immediately call an election. So the Bloc and the NDP sided with the Liberals and said, we are not risking that right now. I'm fascinated to see where this ends, because we have an individual with like an autocratic iron grip on the Conservative Party, but it's slowly cracking and letting people escape purely because of how disgusted they are by his leadership style. It's almost, I would say, like a Trump-level degree of control that is just forcing the more moderate members of the Conservative Party to jump ship, either by switching to the Liberals or just leaving Parliament entirely. And this chaos is affecting them to the point at which they can't even perform the roles required of an opposition. Australia, Canada, we are one and the same at the moment.